Welcome, everyone, and happy 10th anniversary of Canadian Agriculture Literacy Month. My name is Mercedes Unwin, Program and Resource Manager at Agscape. Today, we are joined by maple syrup producers Jodie Aldred and Father Dugald Aldred, who will be taking us on a live tour of their sugar bush and sugar shack. Throughout the tour, we encourage you to ask questions about how we are able to produce delicious Ontario maple syrup.
Hi everyone, I'm here with my dad Dugald and my name's Jodie, so I'll just be leading the tour, but my dad is the producer and the guy with all the facts behind the setup. So we'll switch you guys over and so we're out here in our sugar bush, and I'll start by showing you over by the trees how the lines work. And I guess we can actually we've produced syrup on our farm forever, on the Aldred farm, but 5 years ago our family switched to a new system with lines. So if we take this off here, we traditionally used to have buckets, but now it's on vacuum. So you can see here how it's on a vacuum setup. So this draws the sap out of the tree. And my dad can explain a little bit more what they do throughout the season to get ready for tapping in the bush.
Yes, hello everyone. We're out here in the sugar bush today. It's an ideal day for syrup running. It's been cold at nights the last couple nights, and it's up to about +5 or better during the day, so the sap is flowing well. As Jodie said, there's a lot of work to this in the spring. You have to go home or go through and repair the lines because there's damage from deer and squirrels and wild turkeys all damage the lines. Besides, there's the odd tree that falls down on them and damages them. But we're a mixed farming operation about halfway between London and Chatham. We do quite a few different things on our farm. Maple syrup in the spring during the season being one of the products that we produce on our property.
So I'll take you through. So the lines run all throughout this bush, and this year we actually just added some buckets into another bush. But how many taps are in this bush on lines?
There's approximately 1,500 taps in this bush on lines, and I would guess between 4 and 5 kilometers of lines throughout a 25-acre woodlot.
So we'll take you guys over here to the holding tank that's in this bush where all the sap flows to, and we have coverings over it so that it keeps leaves and any other things that nature may throw within the sap that we don't want in there. So we'll give it a minute here. You can see the sap is flowing in here, and once it gets to a point that it's full enough, it'll release into the holding tank. So my dad can explain a little bit more what this system does.
The system is, there's a vacuum pump up at our building that pulls back here to the bush and draws vacuum on all these lines, which helps to pull the sap out of the trees. And as it sucks it out, it pulls into these here canisters, and as they get full, there's a float valve in them that trips it and dumps it into this holding tank, as you've just seen in the video there.
So this process will happen many times throughout the day, especially on a day like today when it's nice and the sap's flowing pretty good. So my dad can explain as well. I know a question that we have is, what's the difference why did we switch over to the newer system? And my dad has explained that we can produce more and be more efficient. And can you explain what the taps on the trees with vacuum versus the buckets like?
When you put buckets on the trees, you get approximately a liter of sap per day out of a tap. And when you go to buckets, you'll get at least 1.5 liters, if not more, of sap per day.
So
sometimes up to 3 or 4 liters per day on a really good day.
So we'll start heading back to the sugar shack, and on our way back, we can answer a few questions you guys have already. So one question is, how much sap is needed to make maple syrup? Can you answer that?
To make maple syrup, it takes 40 parts of sap to make 1 part of 1 liter of maple syrup. So 40 liters of sap makes 1 liter of syrup.
So when we get back up to the sugar shack, we'll have kind of a rough example of, or a visual of how that is. So one nice thing about switching to lines is previously when we had this bush all in buckets, we'd have to drive through here, and there was quite often times the tractor would get stuck with all this mud.
And I think I made a little error back there when I said it was pumping the sap. It draws about 40 liters of sap per tap, not 4.
Jodie, I have a question. Is there any concerns about animals getting into the sap or affecting the lines connected to the trees?
There's no danger of animals getting into the sap because the tank is all covered. The lines are all enclosed. They can do damage to the lines if the main thing is squirrels will sometimes chew on the small lines. And when they put a pinhole in them, then your vacuum is gone.
So that's, yes, squirrels can be a main pest throughout the bush. So as you can see here, I don't know if you can see in here, but the lines are all throughout the bush. So I remember the day that they had initially set this all up on lines. It was pretty cool. It was a foggy morning and they just went to town putting lines up throughout the bush. So it's a pretty efficient way to do things now. What kind of education is needed to become a maple syrup producer is a question. I would say my dad has grown up with it his entire life, and it's something that's been passed down generations on this farm. But is there any other tips, Dad, that you would have?
Well, the biggest tip is when you're boiling it, don't burn it. It will burn awfully easy when it's close to a finished product. But we find that it's a never-ending learning process in this business.
So especially when we switched over to the new system, there's been a lot of learning curves, but it's been good. Can the sap turn bad? And if it does, how can you fix it?
The sap can turn bad if you get too much warm weather. It will spoil and get sour, and there's no way of fixing it other than to dump it.
So that is why timing is efficient. So we're gonna hop back in the truck and head up to the sugar shack now. So I'll just switch this over here. So a question is, how do you make sap into maple syrup?
You boil it, you put it in and you boil it and keep boiling it until you get all the water content that's in it out, which is about, as I said, it takes 40 to 1. So there's an awful lot of water in it that you have to boil out.
So we'll show you up at the sugar shack. We actually have a system that helps reduce the time on that. And I will switch you guys around here again. Sorry. So here we're driving through our field where the cattle are as well, and there's a line that is run through the field that goes up to the sugar shack and pulls the sap up to the sugar shack, or the ground, sorry. So you can see here just a few of the cattle. So we're actually starting calving season right now, so it's a busy time of year. What is the best temperature for collecting sap from all the trees?
For the sap to run, you need to have -4 to -5 degrees Celsius at night and +5 to +6 or 7 during the days. That's when you get your best sap flow.
So we're just gonna pull in here and head to the shack.
Jodie, another great question would be, how has the vacuum lines been more environmentally friendly or help support the health and well-being of the trees?
Do you want to answer that?
Well, with the vacuum system, the tap is only 5/16 of an inch, where with the old buckets and stuff, older taps used to be 1/2 to 9/16 of an inch hole. So the trees took a lot longer to heal up with the old system.
So that is one way, I guess, if that answers the question for that. I would say it's more a benefit in production end and how efficiently we can produce syrup. A question here is, how old does a maple tree need to be to give sap?
Wise.
1 minute here. Okay, it may have cut out there, guys, but we're back. So we're back up here at the Sugar Shack, and I know one question yesterday was how do we plan to expand, and that is one challenge we run into is you cannot easily plant trees to assist your production because it takes 40 years before we can tap them. So this is the same setup here up at the Sugar Shack and another holding tank. So it all comes into here, and you can see it's right full right now. So then what we will do is it gets pumped into the Sugar Shack, and we'll go show you that next.
So that tank that you've seen back in the bush that was dumping into, there's a line underground from that tank up to this series of tanks here at the building that draws the sap up. And then when it's in all those storage tanks, then we go inside here.
So Dad, another question we have here is, does a maple tree ever run out of sap?
A maple tree will run out of sap as the season goes on. The season is around a month to 5 weeks long. And as it gets closer to spring and the leaves start to get ready to bud on the trees, the sap will all be going to the leaves and you won't get any more sap out of the trees. So it's a very seasonal thing.
All right, so we'll continue into the Sugar Shack here.
This is kind of noisy, but this is the vacuum pump that sucks the sap up from the trees. We'll turn that off for a minute. And then it gets to the tanks out behind the building here.
We'll pull them out from there because it's a little noisy. So that's where the pump is. The pump is in there as well as the reverse osmosis. So maybe shut that door. So I'll show you through the window so it's a little less noisy. So this is the reverse osmosis, and that pulls the water content out of the sap so that boiling time is cut down by a fraction. So want to speak to that more?
This machine with pressure will separate the sap, separate the water from the sugar content, so we can pull out 2/3 of the water out before we enter the system for the boiling process.
Someone's asking how many pumps are in the shack?
Just the one pump in the shack, and it sucks the sap out of the trees, and the same pump draws the sap from the bush.
So once the sap gets pumped up to the Sugar Shack and it's in the holding tanks, we then pump it up into here into the Sugar Shack, and then it enters the system here.
So the tank up there that Jodie pointed out, that is the tank where the sap that has the 2/3 of the water removed from it goes. And it's up there. And from there, there's a gravity feed system out of that tank down into, this is the evaporator, which boils all the water off it. So it comes down into here and runs through. And this pan has about 8 inches of sap in it. And this here's a float box that controls the level of the sap in that pan. So it comes in that end, the fire is underneath, and as the fire is under there, it's boiling the water off and going up the steam trap at the top. And because of the
So I think I just cut him off there because I'm not sure if you guys can hear with what's all going on. So we'll just kind of show you this briefly, and then he can explain it a little bit more.
sap flows through there.
Maybe come down here so that they can hear you a little bit better.
It goes into the big pan and then flows into these 2 little pans, flows through, and the further down it gets to this end, the closer it is to maple syrup.
So what we have here at the end is there's a thermometer. Do you want to point to the thermometer there, Dad?
There's a thermometer right here that goes in the pan that hooks to this, and this is an automatic draw-off machine. So we set the temperature where we want the syrup to be, and we draw it off here about 1 degree before it's finished, so we can finish it in the other pan on propane, and then we can cut the fire instantly because it's too hard to get it here without burning it. So this is going to trip off here in a second or two when it reaches temperature. When it reaches temperature, it automatically dumps until it's once the syrup is no longer syrup and it's watery, it'll stop dumping.
So someone's asking how long you've been in the maple syrup business.
As a family, we've been making maple syrup for about 100 years. But on this level, to sell it commercially, we've been in it for 5 years.
So we'll wait here. So here you can see it's drawing off automatically because it's reached the temperature that we've set it to. So it will actually get drawn off into this keg. We have a timer set, and we restoke the fire every 10 minutes. So once it enters this keg, it will then get pumped over into the other side, and we'll start showing you guys that. So here's a question. How much syrup does your farm produce a year? Do you sell your syrup?
Last year we produced 1,350 liters. The year before it was 1,500 liters. And yes, we sell our syrup both at the farm gate, and we have it in 2 or 3 different grocery stores locally.
And my mother, we joke, is the queen of sales. She loves to go out and be social on weekends, and you can actually see her here. She's stoking the fire. Wave, Mom. So over here we have the finishing pan, and my dad can kind of walk you through this setup here.
So it pumps from that keg that Jodie showed you over there. We have this pump that pumps the sap through into this here pan, which is a finishing pan, which has propane burners under it. So when it's burning there, we can sample the syrup as it's coming along. And as it gets completely finished, we can, there's this here tool right here, which you pour the syrup in, and this here little thing floats in the syrup. And when the number on this thing matches the number on this dial, your syrup is at the right consistency to be completely boiled down in maple syrup. And when it reaches that, we can just turn the valves off, and the heat is off the syrup completely, so it won't get too far gone and become too sugary.
So once we're done, we send it through the filter press here, and then that purifies the syrup so it's not so grainy. And my dad can talk a moment about the sugar sand that's found in.
So the filter press here, which Jodie talked about, takes out what they call sugar sand, which is a natural component that's in the syrup. And this is just a sample of the batch we took off this morning. This is a sample before we ran it through the filter press, and this is a sample afterwards.
So you can see how much more pure that is, and you can actually taste it I am a great taste tester. I taste many samples as we're making it. And you can definitely tell the difference once it goes through the filter press, how much smoother it is. So then once we get it ready for bottling, we keep it at a temperature of, what temperature do you guys keep it at for bottling?
It has to be at 190 degrees. This whole finishing pan assembly here is something that my son built this spring. He does a lot of the layout of it and a lot of the repairs as things go wrong. So after it comes out of that finishing pan, it gets pumped through this filter press, which takes the sand out of it and any other dirt that might be in it. We pump it into this here. This is an automatic bottler. It has
look at the camera so they can hear you.
It's an automatic bottler. It has a water jacketed heater around it, which you heat the water up, and it mixes the syrup in it at 190 degrees Fahrenheit. And you have to have it at 190 degrees Fahrenheit or a little bit higher in order to get the syrup to sterilize it. When you put the cap on, if there might be a little bit of a mold spore or something on the cap, if it's at 190 degrees, you fill the bottle, you lay the bottle on its side like that so that the cap gets totally covered with the 190 degree temperature syrup. And at that point, if there's anything in there, 190 degrees will kill any spore that might be in there, so you will never have mold on your syrup.
So I guess another point to this is it's an automatic bottler. I refer to it similar as a gas pump. So once the bottle is full, this will automatically shut off, which is very handy, and that's been an added addition to our sugar shack within the last couple of years. So this right here we have set up is a comparison roughly. These 2 buckets, if you were to fill those with sap, would make this 1 liter of syrup. So that is a rough comparison for a visual of how much sap it takes to make 1 liter of syrup. So do we have any other questions of the sugar shack here?
It's one other thing we should mention. When you do take syrup off, it is graded, different grades.
Yes, so we did have a question that asked what's the difference between dark and light. So as you go throughout the year, it'll change in coloring. So
at the first of the year, the syrup is very light, and as the year progresses, it just naturally gets darker. And as this chart shows you, as it gets darker, the taste gets a little bit stronger, and that's just a natural thing that happens as the sap proceeds through the spring season.
So not only a lot of people will use, say, dark syrups for cooking, or there's different purposes and different benefits to using the different syrups for depending what you're doing. So these are different bottle sizes that we have, and each batch that we take off, we compare it to, this is our guide that helps us determine whether it's, say, light, amber, or dark. And then each batch, we have a sample bottle that we will put throughout the year. So by the end, this will all be full. And we put the batch number so that when we bottle things, we put the batch number on the bottle so we can always refer back to know what batch it came from. How do you avoid your syrup from drying out?
Syrup will only dry out if it's exposed to the air for so long. Once syrup is in a bottle and it's sealed, it'll last almost forever. It may sugar a little over time, which is just the sugar crystals settling to the bottom of the syrup. Doesn't affect it at all. There's 5 things you have to have on a bottle of syrup. It has to be in a food grade container, everything in your system has to be food grade. So it's either food grade plastic or stainless steel. Everything in the system that the syrup or the sap touches has to be made of that.
There's a question here. Can you explain the grading system of the maple syrup?
The grading system is something that's set up by the government, and this is it. This here is their example of golden or light. This is amber, and this is dark. This is our sample. So you take your sample and you put it in the thing, and whatever color it matches to is what your syrup is graded at.
So Ontario maple syrup producers definitely have a good toolkit for all their producers to access and use throughout the year.
So the sap you see in the bush, which is just clear, goes through this machine, it's boiled, there's nothing added to it, and this is what you end up with from that clear sap at your bottle of maple syrup.
So I guess one thing that my parents and our family likes to make very clear is there's never anything added to maple syrup, as I know sometimes that's a known fact, and other times people question if we add anything to the syrup or not. And all of maple syrup producers, it is a natural product.
Jodie, another great question I have is, can all species of maples be used for maple syrup? Can you use other ones? Is there one type of maple that's the perfect for getting sap? And can you use other types of trees like birch or poplar?
Many trees will produce sap. All of the maples will produce sap, but the hard maple is the best. It produces more sap per tree with a higher sugar content than some of the other maples trees have.
Would you say different trees will have different flavor as well if you tap them?
They'll have different flavors, and certain kinds of maple will automatically give you darker colored syrup.
How much sap have you boiled so far this year in 2021?
We've boiled, I'd have to look at the wall, but I'm guessing about close to 20,000 liters of sap we've boiled so far.
So we have a little whiteboard where we write down all our batches that we've done over here. And I know the first year we got started, the person manning the setup may have got a little distracted. So we always laugh if we don't laugh, but sometimes it doesn't always go perfectly, but we try to. How long do they store syrup? What is the shelf life? So you'll see here we have, these will be completely filled by the end of the year, and we also store in larger containers so that throughout the year we can, depending on demand, we can bottle them into the bottles that you guys are wanting. So you can speak more to the shelf life. I think you already mentioned it a little bit, but.
Yeah, so the shelf life is basically forever. Once the bottle is opened, it has to be kept refrigerated, and it will have that wrote on the bottle somewhere. After opening, keep refrigerated. as I said before, after time, there may be some sugar crystals settled at the bottom of the jar, which doesn't affect the syrup at all. It's just an actual thing that happens over time. And on that bottle of finished product, there's 5 things it has to be. It has to be in a food grade container. It has to have on the container somewhere that it is maple syrup. It has to have the full name and address of the producer. It has to have a grading sticker on it. And it also has to have a lot number on it.
So this lot number, like we mentioned before, is what matches up to the batch sample that we take.
And the reason for that lot number, if there's any health situation down the road, the government can come back and they can get your lot number and test it to see if there was actually something wrong with the maple syrup. So it is a tracing factor, the lot number on the container.
In a day's work, how many bottles could you fill?
Most days lately, we've been filling 100 to 120 liters. So that would be 100 to 120 bottles this size per day.
So someone here has mentioned they have maple trees in their backyard. Can I get syrup from it? And if so, how would I get it? Are the syrup machines readily available?
If you have a few maple trees, you get a spile and a bucket would be the best thing for a few maple trees. And you can just put it in a pot or somewhere and boil it until it turns to maple syrup. And yes, maple syrup supplies are quite readily available at different hardware stores, and there's several stores in Ontario that just deal strictly in maple syrup supplies.
So we'll come over here and answer more questions so you guys can see this a little bit more, just because it's more interesting to look at, I'd say. Have you ever ran into any problems with boiling? Too much sap, burnt sap? We've definitely made the mistake of burnt sap before. Have we ever had too much sap?
We did have too much sap before we bought our reverse osmosis machine, but since we've got that and we can take 2/3 of the water out, we're able to keep ahead of the sap, no problem. That allows you 3 things. You can boil your sap faster because the water's out. It takes a lot less fuel, whether it's oil or wood or whatever you're using, and you'll end up with a clearer, nicer grade of syrup because it spends less time in the evaporator. It just comes out as a clearer grade.
And there's definitely been times where production happens here many hours of the day just because we have to keep up with the amount of sap that is flowed that day. What does maple syrup, or why does maple syrup only come from maple trees? It's one of a kind.
Maple syrup comes from maple trees because maple trees are one of the species of tree that produces the most syrup, or most sap rather, of all other trees. And actually there's maple trees all over the world, but the main place that there's maple syrup made from them is northeastern US, in Ontario and Quebec. And the reason for that is the only place there's maple trees where we get that consistent -4 to -5 and +4 to 5, which gives you the good sap run.
So we will take you guys out here quickly to show you the outside of the shack and the steam rolling off the top.
Jodie, as we're coming to the end of our tour, I just want to have one final question to ask, and you guys can share one final thing you'd like to share with everyone. What is your favorite part of being in the maple syrup business?
You can answer yours first, Dad.
The main part of being in the maple syrup business, it was a crop on our farm that we weren't getting the harvest off till we went in this business. And it's a very social time where lots of people come and stop by and visit and stuff. Not so much right now with COVID, but it is very social time in the spring.
I personally would say that I love it, as there's something always happening in the field or on the farm. And in the spring, it can be a little bit of a slow time. So this is just one more thing that's happening on the farm that it's something to look forward to in a very muddy and not so fun time of year. So, and it definitely gets you ready for summer. So,
well, is there any last tidbits you want to share with everyone about maple syrup production?
No, I think if anyone's ever interested in coming out to the farm or seeing it, they can always message us, and we're always in a standard year, we always like to invite people to come see the operation if they'd like.
Okay, well, on behalf of Agscape and Farm and Food Care, we want to thank you both for your time today and extend a happy Canadian Agriculture Literacy Month to you and everyone. So thank you everyone for taking part in this tour, and thank you again, Jodie and Dugald, for your time today.
No problem.
Thank you.
Have a good day, guys.
Bye, everyone.